Welcome to those who've already joined us. We'll wait a few minutes before starting, just to let, because I can see that our attendees are still coming in. Just to explain to those of you not familiar with the webinar format on Zoom, you will be able to see and hear the panelists, but not the audience. Right at the end of the evening, we will, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, we will open it up and invite you in for a more informal conversation at the very end. But the main part of the program, you will just see the panelists. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have you all with us this evening, this afternoon, this morning. I know that people are still joining, but for those of you who are already here, we're delighted to have you with us. We are recording this session. We are streaming this session on Facebook, on the Rossing Center page. Welcome to this evening's session in a series of Rossing Center webinars on different issues to do with interreligious dialogue. This evening we will be talking with a wonderful panel of experts about the interface between dialogue and action and the complex relationship between those two. For those of you new to the Rossing Center, and I believe that quite a few of you this evening are new to the Rossing Center, the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue is an interreligious organization based in Jerusalem, which promotes an inclusive society for all religious, ethnic, national groups here in the Holy Land. We work mainly in the educational sphere. Our programs contribute to understanding and appreciation of the other's religious, cultural, national narratives, traditions, beliefs, practices. We work to combat prejudice and negative stereotypes and to create and deepen relationships across religious lines, despite differences and disagreement. We're delighted to be here this evening, this evening in Jerusalem, that's why I keep saying this evening, on what is Martin Luther King Day in the US. And all three of our panelists this evening are based in the US and work in that context. It feels only appropriate to have this discussion about interreligious dialogue and action on Martin Luther King Day. We are looking forward to an interesting conversation. And what we will start with individual presentations by each of our esteemed panelists. We're delighted to have you here with us today. And then we will open it up for more of a conversation between the four of us. Our attendees, for those of you new to the webinar format, we can't see you or hear you, but you can communicate to us in the question and answer or in the chat. And we invite you, if you have questions as we go along, to write them in the chat and I will ask them on your behalf. So let's, I also encourage you, if you would like to sign up for future webinars, to sign up for our newsletter and email list so that you can receive future invitations. That should be in the chat shortly. Or to, of course, you can like us on Facebook and follow us there. So we have three wonderful practitioners and speakers with us this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. James P. Buchanan, who was educated at Yale University and the University of Chicago, where he completed a PhD in comparative religions and value systems. He also studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. His teaching and research has focused upon ethics, global systems, and interfaith dialogue. He held the first endowed chair in ethics, religion, and society at Xavier University before becoming university professor and executive director of the Brueggeman Center. James, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the Rossing Center for the invitation to be here with you this morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are. And thanks everybody for joining us. When I founded the Brueggeman Center for Dialogue some 20 years ago, we understood that interfaith dialogue was going to be a major part of what of our mission, of what we were going to be involved in. And certainly we have done that, pursued that mission in traditional ways with conferences, publications. We've been part of the academic organizations such as the Centers for
James, you've suddenly been muted for some reason.
Sorry about that. where did
Okay.
let me just start over. When I founded the organization the Brueggeman Center for Dialogue 20 years ago, we certainly understood that we were going to be doing interfaith dialogue, and we've done a great deal of that in traditional ways. We've done conferences, we've done publications. We're members of organizations such as the CCJR, which is the Centers for Christian Jewish Relations, the International Council on Christians and Jews, and other organizations. But our approach was really we wanted to expand the conversation to other partners. We wanted to bring the other academic disciplines into it. We wanted to bring the nonprofit community into it. We wanted to bring the business community into it, and we wanted to bring government into it. Because what we've found is that these cross-sectoral dialogues or conversations, while certainly the most challenging ones you can have, really are the ones that can have long-term and real impacts within the communities that we within which we work. And we felt like that work was demanded of us because of the kind of fragmentation of our communities, the change in what I talk about in my work of the connective tissue within communities. That connective tissue within communities is no longer the trust and altruism and beneficence and the kinds of things that the scholars who've written on community have talked about, the classics from Aristotle to what we find in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Buddhism, and other traditions. But really, the new connective tissue has become more about markets and technology. And that fragmentation, which has been well documented in writings by people such as Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone and others, we felt like we wanted to be an instrument or an institution that could be responsive to that in some way. So what we do is we take David Tracy, the theologian from the University of Chicago, talks about the three publics to which we do theology. One is the church, the other is the academy, and the third is the greater community, the community at large. We really set out to see how we could combine those, how we could bring the academy, the general public, and the churches, and the faith, when I say church, faith communities, how we could bring those into constructive conversations, into that really moved towards actually doing things. So we've moved beyond really just simply doing dialogue to now we really focus on what we call interfaith collaboration. And the value of that is that, number one, is that it does take on these issues in new ways. It's very challenging because it means that I, as a scholar of interfaith and of religions, end up having to spend more of my time learning the language of politics, of technology, of business, of economics. Because if I want to be in conversation with these other partners who have not been traditional dialogue partners with us, I have to speak their language. I have to speak it at least well enough that I can draw them into my issues, that I can draw them into this conversation that says we have something in common. And so while interfaith dialogue, and I've been involved in that for 30 plus years, typically begins in difference. What are our differences? And then we search for common ground in those dialogues. I find that interfaith collaboration begins with what we have in common. What we have in common is issues that we all agree upon are critical for our communities. What we have in common is the value systems that really demand that we be responsive to those issues. And what we have in common is the community that we share. So a great deal of our work has been that cross-sectoral work. We've spawned out of the center. We've helped create six nonprofits. We've sent our research students doing real world work, but with a faith and interfaith orientation to 64 different countries around the world doing work. And what holds it all together is this attitude of what we talk about as compassion through action, or really moving our values into action. So it's one thing to involve yourself in dialogue. It is a different process to engage in collaboration. But what we found is if we do the collaboration, we return to dialogue, but the conversation has changed. And I'll leave it there and await the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm particularly interested about about where you finished there, and the way that when you in dialogue one begins with difference and tries to find common ground, whereas if one starts with the common ground and building coalitions for action, one arrives at dialogue but from a different place. That's for us here, that's very interesting and very significant. Thank you. Our next speaker is Maha El Elgenedi, who is the founder of the Islamic Networks Group and author of training handbooks on outreach for American Muslims, as well as training seminars for public institutions on developing cultural competency with the American Muslim community. She received an MA in Religious Studies from Stanford University and BA in Political Science and Economics from the American University in Cairo. Maha has taught classes on Islam in the modern world, Islam in the modern world at Santa Clara University, Stanford University, and the University of California at Santa Cruz, and has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Civil Rights Leadership Award from the California Association of Human Relations Organizations, the Citizen of the Year Award from the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, and the Dorothy Irene Height Community Award from the Silicon Valley chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Maha, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good day, everyone. I'm joining you from the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area, so it's 10 o'clock in the morning here for me, 10:15 to be exact. I want to thank Sarah again and your team for pulling us all together for this event and for helping us to prepare for it. As I was introduced, I'm both the founder and now the Chief Innovation Officer for Islamic Networks Group. We've just gone through a transition. We have a new CEO, which I'm really excited about. The organization is 28 years old, and it is a peace building organization that provides grassroots, face-to-face education and engagement opportunities that foster understanding of Muslims and other understood groups. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later, with the intention of promoting harmony among all people. We have several programs that fulfill this work. I'm going to today just talk about the interfaith ones. We have affiliates throughout the United States. I've personally traveled to about 40 states, starting local efforts that mirror the work of ING. And our content is downloaded in all 50 states, as well as in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And as for me personally, I as I was introduced, I have academic degrees in several fields, and I've also studied engineering. I'm ethnically Arab, originating from Egypt. So I'm an immigrant in the United States. I'm married to a Pakistani, and we're both also American, and I'm very excited to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you perhaps Maha, just tell us a little bit more about the nature of the work that you do before we move on to Bob?
Yeah, so I was going to delve into that in response to some of the questions that you'll be asking, Sarah. But we're essentially an educational outreach organization. We started our work with the goal of teaching Americans about Islam and Muslims. And we started in the context of the first Persian Gulf War, when my community, both communities, both the Arab and the Muslim American communities, were experiencing a lot of hate crimes. And for the first time in my life, I felt alien, foreign, and and someone who doesn't belong here. And I knew in my heart of hearts that it isn't because they know something about my culture or about my religion. It's the absence of knowledge that these hate crimes are happening. And so sort of it was a wake-up moment for me, and I thought that education is sort of the best way to confront bigotry and intolerance, and that it was incredibly important for Muslims to be doing the work directly and not allowing other people to speak for us. So we actually started out as an organization to teach about Islam and Muslims in the public square, which is tricky because of our laws here in the United States and separation of church and state. I was very fortunate to come across Dr. Charles Haynes of the First Amendment Center, which is associated with the Freedom Forum, and his organ. He's a constitutional scholar, and his forum taught teachers how to teach about religion in the public square in a way that respects separation of church and state. And so we immediately incorporated and made sure that we integrated all of his work in the work that we do, and we did this for an incredible amount of years, and results were remarkable. The first year that we started the work, we had 300 requests to come out and speak, and that's really how the organization started, and then it evolved into interfaith work after 9/11, when American institutions were especially churches, synagogues, and interfaith organizations were genuinely interested in bringing in Muslim Americans. Prior to 9/11, it was really a conversation that Christians were having within their own community and then with Jews. But Muslims and other religions, I felt, were being brought in maybe because they wanted to maybe have an appearance of wanting to having that dialogue, but I didn't think that it was as genuine as it came to be after 9/11. And so that's when we really got into interfaith work, and it was important for me not to be tokenized, and to also set the table, so to speak, and to invite people to my table to have the conversations that we're now having. And the Interfaith Speakers Bureau was born from there. And then more recently, looking at what's happening in the country, and everybody's been watching what's happened in the country, since 2015. And that's when I realized that we really, in order for us to confront anti-Islam and anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia, we needed to work with African Americans and Latinx communities and Asian Americans and Jewish Americans to confront anti-Semitism and so forth. And that was born another program, the Intercultural Speakers Bureau, where we root Islamophobia and anti-Blackness and really address the real issue here. And the real issue is obviously white supremacy and institutional structural racism. And so the growth of the organization has been quite organic in response to the environment, the political environment and the social environment that we're in. So that's a little bit of history of the organization.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to reflect on first of all, the places that the things that our organizations have in common in our concentration on education, but also on that move between education, dialogue, interfaith, outreach, activism. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker, Rabbi Bob Kaplan. One second. Rabbi Bob Kaplan is the founding director of the Center for Community Leadership, a division of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. He also co-directs the New York-Jerusalem Experts Exchange, a joint project of the JCRC and the Jerusalem Intercultural Center that exchanges best practices in building diverse societies. Rabbi Kaplan is involved in a variety of issues, including conflict resolution, coalition building, interracial faith relationships, combating hate crimes, and community building. Rabbi Kaplan acts as an organizational consultant to many diverse community-based organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, on the issue of intergroup and faith relations and capacity building. Bob, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, and it's a pleasure to meet you both, Maha and James, and thank you for being with us today. But most of all, I have to thank Sarah and the Rossing Center, because I'm supposed to be in Jerusalem right now with a church group that I was with last Martin Luther King birthday, Baraka Church from Brooklyn. It's primarily a Haitian church, and I get some of my best times traveling around Israel with the various different church groups and faith leaders that we get to enjoy being in someone else's space in Israel and Jerusalem and other places in the Middle East through the lens and through the process of traveling with others and feeling it through their experience. And that is a powerful, powerful experience. As Sarah mentioned, I'm with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, and there are community relations councils in most major cities throughout the United States where there's a sizable Jewish population. New York happens to have the largest Jewish population of any city in the world. And I came on board, as mentioned before, approximately, about almost 28 years ago, following the conflict in Crown Heights. It's a neighborhood in Brooklyn. Some parts of the communities know it best as being the center for Lubavitch life, but however, the community is was primarily Caribbean American and African American. It is a community that's been through huge changes, and in the summer of 1991, it was plunged into racial and ethnic conflict. And depending upon whose lens you look through, that's one of the most important things I heard Maha teach is cultural competency, and that is something that is very dear to my heart. Depending upon whose lens you look through, what happened in Crown Heights in 1991 was either a race riot, or a social uprising, or a pogrom. And one has to listen to all the narratives of a community and lend dignity to all the narratives of a community when one is engaged in this kind of work. So I would say that I do interfaith work, intergroup work. However, I never was comfortable with any of those various different titles. And I've actually borrowed a terminology that you use in Israel there. It's called shared society. The fact is, how do we share a society? How do we share resources? How do we share communities? How do we share cities? How do we share a nation? And lend dignity to the other when sometimes we vehemently disagree or just not on the same page with them about where we're going and how we're going to get there. And when I began my work, I was hired as I mentioned before, as a response to a crisis, and it could have been a crisis response. However, I'm a child of America, and I was brought up with a great icon and teacher, not that Dr. Martin Luther King, although he is a great teacher to me, a consistent teacher to me. Never met the man, but I had the honor and pleasure of preaching from his pulpit once in Atlanta, Georgia, from Ebenezer Baptist. And my icon was really Smokey the Bear. And for Americans, we sort of know who Smokey is. Smokey is a big bear that comes on TV and tells us to prevent forest fires. And the best way to prevent forest fires is working together. It's easier to prevent the forest fire. Therefore, it is easier to prevent a conflict in a community. And it's a lot more efficient to prevent the conflict community than to have to put it out and deal with the aftermath. So that's sort of the work of what we've been doing in New York for the past 28 years through the Center for Community Leadership. It's had a lot of different names along the road. This is the latest iteration, and the way we do it, the methodology that we use in New York, and James, you really spoke to me when you talked about action and coalitions. We help to incubate various different coalitions around New York and have been doing that since the 1990s around quality of life issues, ensuring that people are at a problem-solving table, even if they don't necessarily know how to talk to each other initially, although we do a lot of dialogue work that gets them there sometimes. And so they're at a problem-solving process around healthcare, around education, around hate crimes, all that stuff that that Sarah mentioned I'm involved in. Well, that's the reason I'm involved in it, because it helps us to build these coalitions. Another way that we go about doing is we help to form leadership groups, fellowships. We have one called Youth Bridge that was founded right after 9/11 that brings together teens, 11th and 12th graders, 17 and 18, 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. Again, learn how to solve problems together. Whatever the curriculum is, and the curriculum is sort of something that evolves, it's a process of them engaging in a problem-solving process. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to love each other, but we have to lend dignity to the other. And by lending dignity to the other, we get to the place of being able to solve a problem that we have in common. We just recently launched a coalition last Friday on healthcare disparities in Brooklyn. We know that healthcare disparities have been with us for literally decades upon decades. However, the light really got tragically shown or shined on the issue of healthcare disparities because of its impact on COVID, and that communities of color, immigrant populations, and economically disadvantaged groups in America died in larger numbers, sometimes 2 or 3 times the rate of other populations because of these racially promulgated or healthcare disparities that are a result of systemic racism within the United States. So by building these coalitions, and by having these fellowships, Youth Bridge, We Are All New York, we used to have We Are All Brooklyn and We Are All Queens, but it got a little bit difficult to manage them all. We have We Are All New York now. We have brought together hundreds of leaders that know how to effectively work with each other. So it's not about us. It's about us fostering these opportunities within the context of communities throughout New York. So when we see a problem that could lead to conflict, that could not allow for us to be able to effectively work with each other, those folks can then insert themselves within the process, know how to work with each other, and either avoid the conflict or mitigate or navigate a less harmful, less destructive process through a conflict. Conflict happens. I mean, it's sort of like forest fires. They happen and we have to be able to navigate them. I'm certainly going to talk about some examples when questions happen, but that has been the focus of the work that we've done. And some folks, as I mentioned before, some folks in Israel, we have partnered with them on similar type of projects in Israel. We Are All New York has been replicated in Sydney, Australia, and We Are All Sydney. Youth Bridge, our teen program has been replicated in Munich. It's only by people coming to a table, lending dignity to the other, understanding what it is to lend dignity to ourselves, learn how to repair the violation of dignity, and in the process of knowing each other and having those kinds of relationships, able to share a society so that they can effectively either obviate conflict or navigate conflict in a more constructive fashion.
Thank you. That was, I was I've been excited about this evening's conversation for a while, because I knew that even though I have myself been in the field of interreligious work for the last 20 years, that there's always more to learn, and that I have a lot to learn from the three of you. And I'm particularly, Bob, what you said resonates in the easier to prevent conflict than to put out the fire afterwards, and your emphasis on problem solving. And I think that that's something that perhaps we can learn about and learn from in our work. So I want to open up for conversation now. And I guess my first, in a way, you've answered the question as to how you see the relations between the action and the dialogue. Perhaps what I'd like to ask to begin with is, when there are already conflicts and tensions within communities, how do we bring them together? James and Bob, you both talk about coalition building, but when people aren't interested in being in the coalition, how do you bring them in?
Bob, either one, you want me to start or you want to?
Whoever would like to
Please,
start.
James. Please.
Let me just give the example of a neighborhood, and one of the concepts that we base our work around is what we call interfaith social capital. And now, a lot of times we conflate social capital with community. I want to make a distinction between the two. I can live in a neighborhood with people who I don't particularly feel neighborly towards, that we cohabit a common space, but we don't necessarily agree with each other. But what we might do is come together and decide we want to build a playground for our kids to play together. And that's what social capital is. Social capital is doing work together. Social capital is instrumental. It has a purpose, just like physical capital has a purpose. So if we can find an issue, a small thing that we can agree upon, and say we can't agree on this on universal ideas, or what we're supposed to look like as a community in terms of our diversity, etc. But what we can agree upon is this. And if we can come together around this thing that we can do together, then that becomes a stepping stone to building community. We believe in baby steps, that you don't solve these things in grand gestures or grand sweeping agreements or anything else. You solve it bit by bit. And we've seen this over and over in our own community, where we've taken on, we took on, for example, trying to deal with our refugee and asylee community that lives here in Cincinnati. And we brought not only the faith communities into this, but the business and government and the other nonprofits. And first we had to identify this, and we realized, well, we all have refugees as part of our subgroups. And we care about this because our values say we should care about this. And we began to do small things for that community. And as those small things began to come together, then we found that when we got together around other things or in other contexts, we had that to talk about. We had that as an accomplishment that we did together. And as long as you can put that term, something that we did together with what you're doing, you've made a small step. And I think it's a series of small steps. It's why I think this work. I've been involved. I was one of the founders of the Parliament of the World's Religions. And I've been involved in interfaith relations at a global level for a long time. I've been to Israel many times because I work with Shalom Hartman, and I'm part of their Christian Leadership Initiative and other initiatives that they've done. And these things often try to solve these problems in the largest sense of what we mean by dialogue. I think that's valuable. I think it's what we do within the academy. I think it's what we do personally. But I think maybe the really impactful work is that local work that we do through the baby steps and through the small pieces of social capital we build together.
So thank you, James. I'm gonna have to hire you to put my work into words because you said it so well. I'll give you an example. In the early 1990s, looking at what we called the new diversity of New York. Diversity was, as Maha put it before, was sort of classic, Black Jewish, white Jewish, Christian Jewish. It didn't look at everyone else that was really making up the vast majority of the communities of New York. And New York is an incredibly diverse place. And what we began to do is find the issue, and the issue that came onto our radar screen was healthcare and access to healthcare. So even before cultural competency was a language, we formed a number of healthcare coalitions around New York and Queens and Brooklyn. And one in Brooklyn, well, it led to some relationships with the growing Arab population, Muslim population in Brooklyn, South Asian Muslim population, Palestinian Muslim population, Bangladeshi Muslim population, all these various different diverse communities. But where we didn't talk about Abrahamic faiths, what we talked about was access to healthcare and getting child healthcare insurance, Child Health Plus to these communities. So working with the Arab American Family Support Center in its beginnings, we had these relationships in place. And when 9/11 happened, well, we understood as the Jewish community, a rather well-connected, large community in New York, that the Arab American Family Support Center didn't have those points of connectivity. Everyone was looking for it. You're right, Maha. Everyone was looking for it after 9/11. So we helped to hold our first meeting of one of our coalitions around what happened on 9/11, eventually became We Are All Brooklyn, in the Arab American Family Support Center. And then we retracted. We retracted from the process because what happened there is that we had to utilize our connectivity to create connectivity for all. And that was sort of a lesson for our communities and other communities, that sharing connectivity, sharing our access to power, sharing our resources was going to be the pathway to us creating more equitable road and society. And therefore, relationships were built. Well, one of the relationships that was built through that process was with a young person named Fatima Shama. Fatima, who later became the Commissioner for Immigrant Affairs of the city of New York under Mayor Bloomberg, ran our first coalition in Brooklyn, the Greater Southern Brooklyn Health Coalition. And she's now the head of the Fresh Air Fund. That relationship is tight. Do we talk about all the other stuff? Yeah, we talk about it. However, our relationship was formed on very concrete needs that we identified. We formed the relationship. We formed the ability to talk to each other and trust each other, not on everything, but trust each other. And to the point where now, well, we can solve a lot of problems way beyond the ones that are immediate for us. So you're right, James. What happens locally in the communities is the pathway to a more cohesive and equitable society.
Great.
And
Thank
just a quick aside, or to add to that, we also did a health coalition here. We joined together with Children's Hospital and a young Muslim doctor, Riham Olam, who I've already mentioned to Maha, is living in San Francisco now. We were the principals on a grant that we got with the Children's Hospital to create what we called refugee health navigators, helping refugees navigate the health system. And that now is a program that is expanding. So an example of a small program that will expand, but it allows us to come together around that common issue. The other one that I would mention quickly is that we founded a Cincinnati regional coalition against hate, so that when there is a hate speech or a hate act against any of the groups, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobic, or it's homophobic, or it's racist, whatever, that is not an attack on that particular community. It's an attack on all of us. And so if we can come together and respond as a holistic community to the problems that our particular communities are suffering, again, that then creates a new kind of connective tissue, something that we share in common.
Thank you. Maha, I think you also would like to share your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, so the question that you asked is, where do you start when there are conflicts and tensions between religious communities, which is an important question, especially with regard to Jews and Muslims in the United States. So because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think that the mainstream Muslim American community, I'm not so sure about the Jewish, perhaps they also are the same, really define themselves, or define that relationship by where you stand on the issue. Whether you're pro-BDS, whether you consider what's happening as an occupation, whether you recognize the state of Israel, whether you condemn terrorism, and so forth. And so when we, post 9/11, we decided that we would do interreligious education. And how can you do it without Jewish Americans? I mean, we have to include one of the Abrahamic groups. And how do you get Muslims to do this work with Jewish Americans by their side, right? I didn't have any issues. I grew up in Long Island. My best friend growing up in Long Island was an Israeli. And the reason I was able to maintain that relationship is because my mom, who's an immigrant, only got along with other immigrants. And so my mom was friends with my Israeli friend's mom, because they both couldn't speak the language well. They both, were stay-at-home moms, and they just got along really well. And so when I started doing this work, I didn't realize the antagonism that existed between these two communities. And so we quickly had to develop this critical relationship. And the JCRC was the organization to do this work. I already had a relationship with Rabbi Khan, who was running the JCRC at the time. We're talking about 20 years ago. And they had already, some of their members had already done, some work supporting Muslims post 9/11, which was remarkable. And we recognized them for it in one of our events. And so we came together with the JCRC, and a group of Muslims from ING and a group of Muslims from the JCRC. And we started the conversation by asking the question, and this was a question that I had posed to the group. And the question was, is there anything we can talk about other than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which seems to define our relationship? In other words, if that conflict didn't exist, what would we be talking about and coming together for as Americans, as American Jews, as American Muslims? And we put up on a whiteboard over several days answers to these questions, which we narrowed down to two issues. One was, we need to come together to counter anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And related to this were issues relating to security of our houses of worship, our membership in American society, and so forth. And the other issue that came up for us was living our faith, living our identity as Muslims and as Jews with integrity in a growing secular or Christian society. And this sort of gave the context for the relationship that begins to develop between the JCRC and ING, that then begins to invite other Muslims, mostly my donors. I can't say that Muslim institutions joined us immediately. Certainly synagogues did, and they were comfortable doing so because the JCRC, was their filter at the time. And but my donors were also brought in, and it continues to this day, where we stand up for each other and and fight the battles together. And so you have to start where you have things in common. And I'm interested in grassroots work. You can always bring in the elites of the communities together because they have a stake in those relationships. Their funding oftentimes depends on it. They look good in front of the community. It's public relations work. I'm interested in the grassroots, the ordinary Muslim, the ordinary Jewish American, bringing them together in a sincere, genuine relationship where they see each other as human beings. That's what I was really interested in. And it's we have a long way to go, but I believe by doing the educational work that we do, I think we're going in that direction. One of our best programs that does that, and I'm really excited about this, I have to share it with you, it's the Halakha Seder program. And the Halakha Seder came about from my graduate studies. And I studied with Jewish scholars, and I read parts of the Torah, and I had no idea that there was so much in common with the Quran. And the most often told story in the Quran is the Exodus story, right? Which and I read the book of Exodus with the scholars that I studied with, and I came out of that experience and talking to the JCRC in Silicon Valley and said, how come we've never done a Seder together? I think Muslims could actually do a really good job with you on this, because we address it in the Quran, and that's how the Halakha Seder was born. And we continue to come together, and it's become a community theater where we've written out skits looking at different aspects of the Exodus story from both the Quranic and the Jewish perspective on the Exodus story. And that's brought hundreds of people together, ordinary people together to study each other's books. And I think what it's done is it's really built respect for each other. For Muslims, that was really important. And I imagine that it was also for Jewish Americans.
So I want to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned, Maha. and connect them with a question from an audience member. Because you talked about the context that you work in, which is where you have the faith communities, but you have an increasingly secular society. And I wondered whether, so part of my question is to do with how one involves sectors of society who do not consider themselves people of faith or people who are of religious belief and practice. And in particular, somebody in the audience is asking about whether you find young people resistant to conversations about faith in today's increasingly secular world. So I don't know, Bob, if the Youth Bridge program is focuses on faith, or how you navigate today's world where an increasing number of people are not coming from a faith perspective.
So Youth Bridge is not focused on faith. It is focused on, as Maha put it very well, regular folks, students getting together and learning how to effectively create a society together. So they look at issues of commonality. This year, they're looking at criminal justice reform. They're looking at housing issues. They're looking at food insecurity, all the stuff that sort of came from COVID. And they're learning how to work with the other in the context of that organization, again, to solve problems, to be able to feel a connectivity to the other and understanding that the other is necessary in building an equitable society. And they don't always do it through the lens of faith. And that's just the way it is. One of the challenges that we have is an intergenerational dialogue as well between generations. My generation has a very different set of goals and issues and language and way I look at technology. To me, the little thing that we put in our pocket that we spend so much time on is an addendum to me. To younger folks, it is part and parcel of how they view the world. I need to learn from them as they need to learn from me. There needs to be an intergenerational dialogue. So if faith is not their point of connection, okay, so let's figure out how to do it. If faith is their point of connection, okay, let's figure out how to do it. It's listening to who we're working with, finding out where they're coming from, finding out what their needs are, and then creating processes that meet those needs. We can't always figure that we know the answers because, frankly, the folks that we're dealing with know the answers all the time. They're the ones that we have to really listen to. So if it's younger people that are interested in faith, we'll do something around faith. If they're not interested in faith, we won't do something around faith. It really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that different kinds of folks from different silos in life, different ways of life, different backgrounds in life, learn that the other in society is intrinsically their partner. And by connecting to them and hearing them and being with them, they can achieve their goals and the greater goals of society.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and say that for our work, we go into public institutions to supplement something that they're doing that relates to what we're promoting. And, in this case, it's interreligious education. So in public schools in all 50 states, based on national standards, they have to teach about religion, and it comes up in the context of world history, of course, in the context of all sorts of studies, but it comes up in middle and in high schools. And so we have several topics that we talk about, and the interfaith speakers, there are about 12 topics, from the mundane to the more complex. Most often requested panels are shared values, living the faith, more complex separation of church and state, and how we navigate that, and so forth. And so they invite us in to supplement something that they're studying about. And so we're having conversations in what I call the public square, where of course we're going to come across people that are not religious, but they're studying something, they're learning, about something and that's the motivation for them inviting us in. It applies to law enforcement. We do a lot of work with law enforcement agencies on similar topics, because culture diversity and hate crimes is part of the education that they have to do. And in the healthcare system, there are federal and state mandates to do culture diversity work. So ING goes in to supplement something that they're already doing that relates to those requirements. And so that's how we get in the door and have the conversations, not just with other religious folks, but with all Americans who may be religious or not religious. And I think people view this work also from the lens of civil rights, that everybody has a right to be who they are. And so, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans are not much different than African Americans or Latinx or Asian Americans that we have to study about. But we're very authentic, and we talk about our religious beliefs and our religious values, and it's remarkable to me some of the feedback that we get is that, boy, I've learned a lot about Muslim Americans, Buddhist Americans, Hindu Americans, Jewish Americans, or I can't believe that you guys all get along. There's just, so much respect and friendliness between you all. And it was really refreshing to see. We get the feedback, I can't believe you're all normal. You're like ordinary Americans, but yet you believe in this stuff. Some of you, it's more about philosophy, and for others, you really believe in God, and you believe in revelation and heaven and hell and so forth. And it's exciting to see that exchange happening with Americans of all backgrounds. So, we don't, and so that's how we engage with people who are secular and people who don't believe in religion.
And I just would echo what both Maha and Bob said, who both said it very well. I think what we have in common is the issues. We share issues. It doesn't matter whether we care about poverty, we care about the environment, we care about all these equity and these issues within our community. And if we come together around the issues as opposed to doing some kind of identity check, whether we're from a faith community or from a secular community, whatever, we find that common ground. And it all is about finding common ground. And as I said, the advantage to that is we'll come back to the dialogue, but the conversation has changed now. And it's not just the conversation between the faith communities has changed. The conversation between the secular community and the faith community has changed as well, because we found common ground. And that's what we're looking for in what we do. And it increasingly, I think that as a scholar, as someone who writes as well and does that, that becomes an increasing emphasis upon the work that I'm doing, is that I'm not, when I put coalitions, these cross-sectoral coalitions together, I'm not concerned with being right. What I'm concerned with is being the catalyst to see what will emerge and be satisfied with the process. Bob mentioned the process. I think process is the product. And if we can really focus on good, wholesome, healthy process where we listen and we speak and we work together, if that process is a healthy process, we'll continue to work together. If we're focused on product, meaning I think I know what's right and you think you know what's right, and we make that a point of conflict, we may come out with a product, but we may decide not to work together again. So within the center, the greatest people have always asked, how do we judge success? And you can judge it by audience size, or you can judge it by who all got involved and so. But what the greatest success for us is when the organizations that we work with, and I should note, in the 20 years of the Brueggeman Center, We've never done a project alone. We've literally partnered on everything we have ever done. We believe in collaboration to the very core of us. So we will not do anything alone. And the greatest point of success is when somebody comes back and wants to work with us again, or wants to continue that work. Now, with young people, I think this is particularly effective, because if you go with young people and they do a project together, secular and religious, and then you can engage them in conversation about that project and why they got involved, then we find that, in fact, the values that come from the secular young people and the values that come from the religious young people are not that different. They're the same values. They may have different sources, but they're the same values. So I just think that the focusing on the commonality, what we have in common, and those are the issues and the values and the community that we share, really is how we move the work forward with young people and old people alike.
And if I can just add to that, sometimes the secular moves to the faith. What I mean by that is that I have a very dear friend. We've been working together now for a real long time. His name is Mohammed Razvi. Mo, as they call him, my wife always says that I've been to more countries with him than I've been with her, so she gets a little jealous sometimes. For Mo, I went to go visit him one day, and I saw there was a whole lot of seniors wandering around his organization called COPO, located in Brooklyn. And I asked him, what's going on here? He says, well, we're trying to develop a senior center here because there isn't a Muslim based senior center in Brooklyn. There's a lot of other ones because, other groups have been here longer and they've got the government contracts. And as I said to him, so tell me more about it. He said one of his needs was halal South Asian meals on wheels. In other words, bringing food to folks' home. Now, a Jewish organization in the area had the contract, and they were delivering kosher Eastern European type food, to seniors in the community. Well, Muslims the majority of Muslims could have eaten that food because it was kosher and therefore, permissible by many folks around being halal. However, it wasn't South Asian. It wasn't the food that older folks, you get a little finicky. I know I'm getting older, so you get a little finicky. And you say, like, well, I want something that's going to be comforting to me. What we did, because the secular went to faith, the issue was seniors and aging. We helped put him together with the Jewish organization that had the contract. They now have a joint contract. And it's rather than being in conflict around the issue, because they could have gone at each other, who's going to get the goodies. One group is now delivering halal South Asian meals to folks that are aging in one community, and another one's delivering kosher meals. Everyone gets to participate in the needs that the community has articulated, their faith needs, deep-seated faith needs. However, they started in a secular conversation around aging. So sometimes these things evolve in directions you just never know, and they get to a space where you can solve the problem rather than going into conflict with each other.
Thank you. An interesting question from the audience. How has the Black Lives Matter movement affected your work?
In Cincinnati, a great deal. I mean, we've got a history of conflict. We go back about 17 years where we had riots and because of the killing of a young Black man, and more recently, within the last few years, a killing of a Black man at the University of Cincinnati campus. So it affects us very deeply. We're involved with a project that, Bob, you may know about, called Inheritance. It's out of New York, and they actually come into a community, identify an issue, and then bring the community together, create a play, which you write together about, which tells the story and the narrative of something. And COVID has interrupted that because we were supposed to be going through it last spring. But we're involved with an organization, with a group, a coalition called Jubilee. and Black Lives Matter is very involved in that. And our issue there is equity, of course. Our issue is how do we extend the same rights and goods and services that we as a white population take for granted to these communities. So we'll be doing this coming fall, actually, because it takes that long to do it. We'll be doing a major national conference on home ownership, which is the single most indicative factor in terms of equity between Black-white populations. And so how do we create home ownership for the Black community? We're working with faith communities here, as well as the Black community, to create a Black owned and operated credit union, which can then extend credit and do neighborhood economic development and do some of these things. So I think there's a group that we're partnered with called Equation, which actually runs a thing with us called the Cincinnati Festival of Faiths, where we bring all the faith communities together once a year just to not only celebrate the diversity, but also our tagline is compassion through action. We do interfaith habitat builds and other things together. But we've got a new thing called a mighty stream, where we are in the faith communities trying to figure out what is our role in this, and how can we not only be in conversation with Black Lives Matter, but how can we be part of ongoing projects, and again, building that social capital with them that I spoke of before.
Maha, you were?
Yeah, I wanted to say that in two ways. Black Lives Matter had a personal impact on me, even though I do this work, and I've been doing this work for 28 years, countering Islamophobia. It was the Black Lives Matter, which actually begins under, it's been going on for, civil rights has been going on for a long time, but under President Obama, this is when we begin to see the protests. It really had a profound impact on me. It was sort of was an aha moment for me, as they say. And so it affected us in two ways. We began to talk about Islamophobia in the context of anti-Blackness, as I mentioned earlier, and developed a whole program around this, where we look at the history of the creation of narratives about a people, including Muslims and Arabs and Jews and Blacks and Asians and so forth. And we relate all of these and talk about the process of racialization, internalization, the history of it in the United States, and then what do we need to do to counter it? And what we try to impart on people is to say that a lot of the narratives that we have about each other are historical and centuries old. We didn't create them, but we need to be aware of them, and we need to counter them. And it's been incredibly successful. It's probably one of the most requested work that we do right now in all sorts of venues, and not just in education or universities, but also in law enforcement agencies and Rotary clubs and so forth. So we're incredibly excited. We actually came up with developed lesson plans, 15 lesson plans for educators to be able to teach about this. In relation to ethnic studies and so forth. But in the other way is that we looked internally within our own community, the Muslim American community, looked at our own intra-Muslim racism, which was a very difficult thing to do, but we needed to do it in order for us to be authentically doing the work that we're doing to counter racism. And we did a series of programs, webinars. If you go to our website and search for intra-Muslim racism, you'll see the webinars. We did one on the history of Muslims in America, Muslim African American communities today, roots of racism, within Muslim American communities, what that looks like, and then calls to action. The last webinar was amazing. This is where, and all of them, of course, we had African American Muslim leaders talking to us. But the last one was just incredible because they came up with suggestions for how to counter it internally within. I think it's incredibly important for religious communities, in particular white Christian communities, to be doing this work internally. And of course, the same with Jewish Americans, just as Muslim Americans need to do it. And we're just beginning to do this, but Muslim Americans, especially Arabs, Turks, Iranians, and people that pass for white, and even people from the subcontinent need to address racism towards Blacks. Mm-hmm.
So, as Maha said, civil rights movement's been going on for a long time, but I think the Black Lives Matters has sort of called us to task in many, many different ways. And one of the most interesting things about it is, by the way, Black Lives Matter. It's not even a question. It's like, yeah, that's the essence, and in many different ways. So one of the things that happened is that our own Jewish community had to come to terms with our own internal diversity, Jews of color. It's something that we did not come to really understand as well. And it's something that we are now learning how to navigate, our own internal diversity, and that where everyone sort of looked at us as the descendants of Fiddler on the Roof, that just ain't necessarily so. So one of the things we did years ago is we did a diversity Seder. I know that Ma talked about her Seder. Our diversity Seder was a little different. We talked about the own internal diversity within the Jewish community. Part of it was done by Ethiopians, by Yemenis, by Bukharians, by people from the Ashkenazic background, people from Cuba. The Cuban thing was really interesting. The Cuban rabbi started singing part of the Haggadah, the book that we use to navigate through the Seder, and he was using a certain tune, and all the Latinos in the room started singing along. It was a traditional Latino tune, an old folk tune that had been used for the Haggadah, and they used it for something else. That was continuity, that was connectivity. However, we had to confront our own internal issues about racism within the Jewish community. We had to learn what it meant to be more engaged in the undoing racism movement in America, and what that really looked like, and what was that all about, and everything from book clubs to reading White Fragility or any of the other books out there on us confronting our own internal racism. We hope to found a coalition that we have been working on for a couple of years now. One was founded literally in January, right before COVID, a Jewish coalition on criminal justice reform, because criminal justice is an issue that says Black Lives Matter. We're helping to form now a coalition, as I mentioned before, on healthcare disparities, because Black Lives Matter, because so many Black lives were destroyed and lost through the issue of healthcare disparities in America. What's our role in all this? And how do we partner with Black Lives Matters as in its own diversity? Because and I know that there's some disturbance in the field. Maha talked earlier about the issue of Israel and Muslims. Well, certain folks in one of the pieces of the Black Lives Matter movement injected Israel and BDS and all that other kind of stuff that's important to the Jewish community in the process. We have to navigate that. We have to learn how to navigate that without us not saying that Black Lives Matters. So it becomes complex, it becomes difficult, but the baseline is that Black Lives Matters, and we have to see our role in partnering and working with the Black Lives Matter movements and in its movements in locally and globally to figure out how we're going to create a more equitable and just society in all aspects. We need to undo the systemic racism that has been at the core of the American experience literally since our beginning.
It's become a real theme within academia and elsewhere to really begin to deal with what we call implicit bias. We have the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center here in Cincinnati, who has a lab for this, and that's all important. But what Black Lives Matter has done is it's called to us to say, quit just talking about it, do something. Don't just talk about the fact of our racism and that it's systemic. Start breaking down the structures. And I think that's the call. That's the demand. And that's a sea change for all of us, because we can't just sit and politely talk about it anymore and claim we're not racist when we look at the way in which our societies are structured, which are in fact racist. So I think the call is to say, do something.
And I say
that's a fantastic place to begin to wrap up. I'd like in a moment after your final remarks, we will allow our participants to join us for some more informal conversation for the last few minutes. But first, I would like to give you all a chance to just 1 or 2 sentences of final remarks. Bob, your microphone is open. Why don't you start?
I'm sorry, there's a coughing. I got my COVID shot this morning. I'm getting some of the feelings from it. Yeah, I want to take it from what James just said. We can't just talk about it anymore. We have to face up to it. We have to do the work. We have to engage in it. We have to listen to our partners in the complex diversity of America, or wherever we're. It's in Israel, and I know I've done a lot of work in Israel over the years, or any other place that that there's these conflicts, and conflict happens everywhere. I don't care how monochrome you think your society is. Diversity is diversity. We have to act upon it. We have to hear what is at the core of the problems or the issues that other parts of our community are looking at and engaging in. Whether it was me listening and dialoguing with my friend Mo around Meals on Wheels, or hearing about gun violence in Brooklyn, in core centers in Brooklyn, or hearing about other issues around healthcare, or whatever the issue is. I always kid around, it could be about underwater basket weaving. I don't really care what the issue is, as long as it's important to our partners in society. It's a way of bringing us together. And it's a way of creating a more equitable society. We have to go beyond speeches, as James said it well, and I heard the same mantra coming from Maha, is that we have to go beyond just talking about it to the action, the core of what you said before. And that is going to take hard and difficult work, both internally and externally, is seeing how those issues play out in us, seeing what resources we have to bring to the table, and creating the opportunities for moving the agenda forward. I know that, and I'll sound like a rabbi just for a moment, one of my great teachers, one of my rabbinical teachers, because I've had teachers from almost every spectrum of the universe, and that's a blessing, by the way. That's a real blessing. Once, when we were in a very difficult space in our learning, and there was a lot of disagreement, a lot of hard feelings, a lot of bad stuff, he looked at us, he sighed, he felt the pain of our conflict, and he said, now is the time, and he used the Yiddish word, he said, now is the time to go weiter. Now is the time to go forward. We need to feel the pain, take that sigh, and move this forward. This is our responsibility, and this is our obligation as people who are involved in this work or have been thrust into this work through some quirk of history.
Thank you. Maha.
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about, in addition to what everybody has already said, talk about the economic side of this. I think that foundations, local government and federal government, I'm very excited about the promises that President-elect Biden has made about bringing Americans together. We've introduced some ideas to his transition team that I hope he is going to consider and look at. But I think that the foundations, governments, and people need to invest in good work that's happening around bringing people together in interfaith work. There are a lot of incredible organizations out there that are very much mainstream, that are led by very trustworthy people that have a lot of integrity, that have been doing this for years. Those organizations, and very much part of the mainstream, they're not viewed as being on the fringe, but very much part of the mainstream. I think that those organizations need to be supported and funded, and I'm hoping that that happens under the Biden administration by foundations and local government and organizations like yours, quite frankly, Sarah. And then two, I think that interfaith leaders also have a role to play in this by not working just within their own bubbles. It reminds me a lot of what I saw in the academy, where scholars are just talking to each other and they're very happy with each other and read each other's work and applaud each other's work and so forth. We need to go beyond that but they need funding, obviously, to do marketing, to better outreach, to do better public relations, to show concrete outcomes and benefits to their work. I mean, I heard several things expressed today. In my area, when I first started, we had Islamophobic and anti-Semitic speakers in our area. We don't see that anymore because of the relationships that have been developed and the greater understanding that has been developed as well. We have Jewish and Muslim day schools coming together on their own because people are seeing, oh, Muslims and Jews can get along with each other. They don't compromise their views on Israel or Palestine. They still view issues in similar ways, but they approach these issues in a much more thoughtful way than they might have before. And they have friends now that they can talk to, whereas before they didn't have any outlets other than the voices of extremists, right? Things like that, I think we need to talk about, but we can't do it without support. And then we also have to keep in mind that we don't have to reach everybody. There is, studies have shown, I forget the name of the author now. Is it Malcolm Gladwell who wrote The Tipping Point, or somebody else? I don't remember. We just need to reach a critical mass of people. 10% is what studies have shown, and it's been as small as 3% of the population. So we can do this, but it's going to take, I think, support by the public.
Thank you. James.
Well, I mean, for me, it just goes back that I think the work is local. I think we have these kind of comprehensive global conversations, and as Maya says, we academics are very good at that, and we enjoy it. It's a kind of it's a kind of game we play, but it doesn't have effect. So I think it's local. I think that we have to learn that it's about baby steps, that we're not going to make giant strides, and this is long-term work. We take on projects that we incubate for a decade at a time, and we hope at the end that we have progress. I go back to that term social capital, that it's not about community first, it's about social capital first. Do something together, and that's one of the baby steps towards actually building community. And I think that part of what we need to really be concerned with is reconstituting or reestablishing a different type of connective tissue within our communities. What connects us? What pulls us together? Is it markets and technology, or can we go deeper? Can we do a deeper dive? And we do that deeper dive one project at a time. We are, and to Maya's point about funding, we are funding. Bob, you may recall, I don't know whether you attended it, we created an exhibit about 15 years ago called A Blessing to One Another, Pope John Paul II and the Jewish People. And it was at the Museum of Jewish Heritage for quite a long time. It was a huge event. That toured the United States for a decade. We then opened at the Vatican, and we've given it as a gift to the John Paul Center in Krakow, Poland, as part of their permanent exhibit. That now has been repurposed as a nonprofit called Empowering Interfaith Collaboration. And so we're going out and walking the talk. We're going out and saying, if you'll go out and if the faith communities will go out and engage in these projects, we'll help fund you. We'll put the money behind you to do it. And then, as Bob said in an earlier point, we track it. Once we fund a project, we see whether those communities continue to work together. And what we're finding is about 75% of them do. because they learn the power of collaboration. They learn, again, what they share in common is the issues and the values and the community. And I think that's the path. It's going to be slow, difficult work. We're living in one of the questions that you had was, how do we deal with the fundamentalist community? Well, that's become not only a more challenging question, but it has become a question that is almost an emergency question right now, given what happened on January 6th and the role that those communities have played in that. But I think that the rest of us have to come together and figure out not just this claim that we are a community, but what the work goes in to really becoming a community. And I again, our thanks to the Rossing Center for bringing together, and such a pleasure to meet Bob and Maha. And I hope we'll have occasions in the future to work together and be together, all of us.
Thank you. I am deeply grateful to all of you for joining us this evening. You have certainly given me much food for thought. So thank you very, very much. We will now begin to let in